Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Mendez.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Jennifer, for that warm introduction. And thank you for the National Academy of Sciences invitation to speak to you today about my research agenda that looks at issues of climate change, public health, and specifically environmental justice. How are communities of color responding to the threats and impacts of climate change, either from mitigation issues, pollution, or direct impacts from extreme events, extreme weather events. So thank you for this opportunity. And before I jump into my presentation that I'll be speaking about today, I want to just highlight a little bit about my research agenda, my background. Some of you may know my research agenda from the book Jennifer mentioned, my first award-winning book, Climate Change from the Streets. This book contributes to the fields of urban and environmental studies by highlighting how social movements and other actors are influencing the policymaking process to ensure equitable climate change solutions in low-income communities of color throughout the United States and globally. Building on this multi-scalar approach, my research agenda evolves now from policymaking about climate pollution mitigation that is prospective to adapting socially vulnerable populations from the immediate impacts of climate change. This shift in focus is necessary because the impacts are happening sooner than projected and are creating a public health emergency, particularly for the most disempowered and voiceless populations. So I'm really excited to be talking to this multi-generational audience from high schoolers, college students, to faculty and alumni, and really highlighting how climate change is becoming more real to individuals, particularly in forms of disparate health impacts that are happening to the most voiceless populations. So my research agenda and research I'll be talking today addresses populations that are rendered invisible during disasters such as wildfires. For example, in recent fires here in California, the economic impact of smoke taint is estimated to have cost the California wine industry $3.7 billion. Smoke taint occurs when smoke and ash permeate the skin of grapes, which can affect the taste and smell of wine. However, too much concern is often placed on the impacts to the wine industry, but not on the farm workers that are harvesting the grapes during wildfire events and how their lungs are also being tainted. They are not provided with adequate occupational health and safety protections, let alone hazard pay or federal disaster assistance funds to work in mandatory evacuation zones that are considered hazardous to the general population. Making these inequities visible is important because in California, as many of you know here in this audience today, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to the existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, wildfires in California are not isolated disasters. They often now compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. So now more than ever, it's important and crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of extreme wildfire impacts to undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. While this talk is based on impacts to California's most marginalized and stigmatized populations, this research has global implications. California's wildfire problems are now impacting the world. Last year, smoke from multiple extreme wildfire events not only reached New York State, but also Western Europe. California smoke is now impacting sensitive populations globally. Given their social status, undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants are particularly vulnerable to disasters such as wildfire and require special consideration in disaster planning. They are disproportionately affected by racial discrimination, exploitation, economic hardships, less English and Spanish proficiency, and fear deportation in their everyday lives, their pre-disaster marginalized status. So I really start this research with the premise, if we really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants before a disaster, really integrating them into our society, particularly our social safety nets, such as healthcare, disaster assistance funds, unemployment assistance, and other resources that will help them when a disaster strikes. And it's important to note that when a disaster does strike, it only exacerbates existing inequalities. And these inequalities that are exacerbated during a disaster creates this form of hyper-marginalization for this population, particularly because there is no social safety net for them. Our research on the 2018 Thomas fires in California's Ventura and Santa Barbara counties was developed in a co-productionist framework. Migrant rights and environmental justice groups that lived and worked during the wildfire disaster are also my co-authors. They were vital contributors to the research design and data collection and analysis. They were also key in presenting study findings to multiple policy audiences at the local, state, and even international levels, including the United Nations International Organization for Migration. Moreover, this co-productionist framework shows that undocumented migrants are rendered invisible in the context of public policy by systemic racism and cultural norms regarding US citizenship and who is the victim. Our research highlights how political choices are being made that prioritize some lives over others during disaster. So a quick outline of my talk today. I'll begin with an understanding of wildfire and inequality. Then I'll proceed to talk about an overview of the Thomas Fire, my case study, and its impacts to undocumented Latino Indigenous migrants, highlighting key disaster impacts. And then I'll end with a broader policy implications of this research. And then finally, I'll update you on some fires that are also occurring in Sonoma County, which is my new research site. According to recent proceedings of the National Academies, climate change is making wildfire season longer and more severe. On average, wildfires in the western United States burn 6 times the acreage they did 45 years ago. In California, Sierra Nevada, the frequency of wildfires since 1970 has increased by 256%, as the mountain snowpack melts earlier and fire seasons extends year-round. Moreover, 18 of the 20 largest wildfires by acreage in California have occurred since the year 2000. The top eight has occurred since the year 2017. The Thomas Fire, our region of study, is currently ranked as number 8. However, just over a year ago, the Thomas Fire was considered the second largest wildfire in California's history. So you can see the frequency and severity of these wildfires over the last several years. Moreover, while climate scientists expect wildfires to become more frequent and severe, it is important to explore how some people and communities are more affected by these events than others. Our research shows that differences in human vulnerability to wildfires stem from a range of social, economic, historical, and political factors. These factors include unequal access to disaster preparedness knowledge and resources, contrasting legacies of forest management practices, and the expansion of residential development into the wildland. We further analyze vulnerability through the social cultural context that causes structural vulnerability for undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants in the first place. We look at the processes that includes factors such as systemic inequalities and discrimination that exposes them to higher risk and underscores how government institutions, disaster relief infrastructure, both public and private, can exacerbate existing inequalities during wildfires. However, the majority of wildfire studies only analyze groups as inherently being vulnerable. For example, this study from the University of Washington, while valuable to assessing disaster risk, frequently renders invisible the policies and programs that enable underlying inequalities. Although such indices correlate how disaster risk is unevenly spread across race, class, or gender, they often fail to elucidate the causation. For example, these vulnerability mapping projects use census data. And as many of you know, there's a severe undercount of undocumented individuals in the census data. Particularly, many of them are afraid to talk to government officials that they perceive may use the information to hand over to the Department of Homeland Security or the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency for deportation services. And moreover, such data that uses census information also, it renders some regions of California invisible because, as you can see from our study area up here in Santa Barbara and Ventura County, is showing very low levels of vulnerability. But our research shows that undocumented migrants are particularly vulnerable to wildfires when they occur. But because there's so much high-income individuals in these two counties, again, it renders them invisible. Identifying these populations and systems that render them vulnerable is important because in California, while many of these fire-prone places are largely populated by higher-income groups, they also include hundreds of thousands of low-income individuals who lack the resources to prepare or recover from fire. These numbers will likely surge according to the California Fourth Climate Assessment Report, which projects that the state's wildfire burn area will increase by 77% by the end of the century. The state of California, however, does not have an analysis of wildfire based on social vulnerability or a more holistic methods to identify and safeguard hyper-marginalized populations like undocumented migrants. In a few moments, I will discuss the direct impacts and the responses in the Thomas Fire in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. But first, I would like to provide some background on the fire and undocumented migrants in the region. In particular, the forms of discrimination and unsafe labor conditions faced by undocumented migrants. In this regard, as one resident of Santa Barbara told me, undocumented migrants are the invisible population living and working behind the Bougainvillea curtain. They are struggling to survive in a region of wealth and prosperity. This idiom references the fast-growing evergreen vine with an explosive magenta color visibly adorning gates of expensive estates and farms for added privacy. On December 4th, 2017, the Thomas Fire started north of the city of Santa Paula in Ventura County. It grew quickly to nearly 31,000 acres or 50 square miles in less than 12 hours. Its explosive growth was driven by a combination of climactic events, including dry foliage, low humidity, and intense Santa Ana winds that gusted up to 60 miles per hour. At the time of final containment on January 20th, 2018, 40 days later, the Thomas Fire would be classified as the second largest wildfire in California's history at that time. The firestorm affected hundreds of thousands of residents in the counties of Ventura and Santa Barbara County, resulting in massive blackouts, the destruction of over 1,000 buildings, and the fatality of one firefighter. Media outlets across the country focused news reports on the loss of coastal and hillside mansions and impacts to wealthy homeowners and farmers. The Thomas Fire, however, not only destroyed expensive property and crops, but also endangered the health and livelihood of thousands of undocumented migrants. California is home to an estimated 2.6 million undocumented migrants, many of whom are farm workers or are employed in service jobs such as housekeeping and landscaping. In Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, undocumented individuals are estimated to account for more than 9% of the population, or 111,000 people. While disaster relief efforts in the Thomas Fire have largely been praised as effective, migrant workers were especially impacted from the fire due to the loss of employment, the lack of evacuation information in their native languages, confusion about eligibility for disaster relief services, and poor infrastructure and housing in migrant communities. Undocumented migrants' socioeconomic situation is usually precarious. However, the wildfire disaster intensified the already difficult situation. The Thomas Fire also revealed how undocumented migrants and those with seasonal work visas require special consideration in disaster planning. These individuals are often afraid to seek help and restitution during and after a wildfire for fear of deportation. Undocumented migrants are also unable to access disaster relief services because of language barriers and an explicit prohibition from accessing federal disaster assistance funds and programs. Governments in the regions in particular overlook the needs of low-income indigenous migrant workers and their families. Ventura and Santa Barbara Counties are home to a growing indigenous Mexican population. It is estimated that over 25,000 indigenous people from Mexico live and work in Ventura County, and Santa Barbara is home to a population estimated at 29,000. Concentrated in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops and cut flowers, indigenous migrants perform an increasing amount of the arduous labor, which contributes to the profitability and affordability of fresh fruits, vegetables, and wine. In particular, indigenous people in Ventura and Santa Barbara County are culturally and linguistically isolated. Many are illiterate, and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native languages, such as Mixtec, Triqui, Maya, or Chatino. It is important to note that indigenous people are not Hispanic or Latino, but are indigenous. They are often homogenized with the general Latino population. Desperate outcomes occurring during and after wildfire have major environmental justice implications, in that certain populations, due to their socioeconomic status, must live with a disproportionate share of environmental impacts and suffer the related public health and quality of life burdens. Due to racial discrimination, they are often unable to communicate with people beyond their own indigenous community, impedes their ability to obtain appropriate health care, housing, education, negotiate with their employers to improve their work situation, and exercise their basic civil rights. With these variables in mind, our research adapts the work in the field of public health that examines the issue of intersectionality. That is, how social categories such as gender, class, race, indigeneity, immigration status, and other aspects of human identity intersect with wildfire disaster. The concept of intersectionality has been used to highlight how these categories of culture and identity overlap, hiding the effects of discrimination, exclusion, social inequality, and a systemic injustice in the lives of specific individuals. An intersectional approach to wildfire disaster emphasizes how certain people and groups suffer worse effects because of overlapping factors that are often measured separately. So now I'll be speaking about the direct impacts that were observed during the Thomas wildfire. And it's important, and in particular, it's important to mention how during this wildfire event in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties in 2018 and 2017, there was no official government response for this population, while undocumented migrants had been living in this region for decades, if not multiple generations. The government officials did not allocate any disaster preparedness resources or assistance before the disaster event occurred. So in response to no official government response, the community had to step up and step in and provide key services for this community. One of the key issues that happened in the Thomas wildfire was a lack of language access to emergency information. Many people often think of California being very progressive, being very multicultural, particularly with the Latino community, the Spanish-speaking community. But when this wildfire disaster broke out in this region, neither county, Santa Barbara or Ventura County, had allocated any full-time staff or public information officer to do live translations or interpretation of essential emergency information from evacuation zones to shelters or where to get assistance or things about boil alerts or air quality, hazardous air quality. In fact, at one point, the county did not have anyone to translate this information. They had one sentence and some of the emergency information that read it in Spanish. If you can't read this, please take it to somebody that can translate it for you. About a day or two later, there was a slight improvement. They added a Google Translate box there to translate the emergency information, but several years ago, that Google Translate was not that great. And it was erroneously translating important information, such as the word wildfire from English to hairbrush in Spanish. So yes, and this occurred for 10 whole days until community groups really pressured politicians and elected officials in Sacramento to lend somebody from the Governor's Office of Emergency Services to do live translation for this region. But before those 10 days, the community did step up. There's a lot of migrant rights organizations, particularly indigenous migrant rights organizations and environmental justice groups that went on social media, such as WhatsApp, which is a text messaging platform that a lot of migrant communities use to send out emergency information. They also use Facebook and Instagram Live, as well as their low wattage radio station to translate this emergency information in Spanish and in indigenous languages that are commonly spoken in these two counties. And also, there was really this issue of language injustice, of not providing timely, real-time information in Spanish and specifically in indigenous languages such as Mixtec. And I want to emphasize how important it is to translate this information into an indigenous language such as Mixtec. Some people may think may have the wrong impression that since they're all Mexican, they speak Spanish, or that the Spanish language is similar in dialect or in sound to an indigenous Mexican language such as Mixtec. But I want to play a quick audio clip for you, where you can hear the key differences. You can play now.
Mà khi ta tụi cu khỏe rồi chắc cu vi can ô ta na tụi na chinh đó lon đó chinh đó aju undo nhà can đó tan đó chỉ sa cu chân bên tan đó nhà ta cắt chân đó đã ăn đó nhà ta chinh đó nung đó nhà cái tụi cu nhà tụi sinh
Okay, you can stop now. So as you can hear for yourself, that the language Mixteco or Mixtec sounds nothing like Spanish. And I often, when I do my policy briefings with my community co-authors, we like to play that audio clip to remind policymakers and other individuals in positions of power how different, culturally and linguistically different, these languages and demographic groups are. Other emergency information that was not translated into Spanish, as you can see, is it's air quality, hazardous air quality. You can see the purple and the maroon area is considered hazardous or very unhealthy for all population groups. But this information was not being conveyed to farm workers who often have multiple forms of health disparities or inequalities, such as respiratory diseases, cancer, and other issues that can be exacerbated by hazardous air quality. Also, information on boil alerts was not being translated. As you can see, that red areas where you needed a boil alert, those are primarily, particularly on the left side, is migrant communities. And moreover, the science around these boil alerts is not exact, and it's a very understudied issue. There's been recent research from the University of Purdue University, that has found high levels of benzene and other carcinogens in the water systems days, even several weeks and months after a wildfire. So it's important to note that if you boil this water that's contaminated with such type of hazardous compounds, it actually will speed up the toxicity of that water, and it's even more hazardous for individuals to drink. So there's a movement now to not only translate this information, but also to let people know of how hazardous it is, and that individuals should not even be drinking it, and in some cases not even be taking showers with this type of water. Other key impacts were to worker health and safety impacts to farm workers. So as we can see from this, this picture, individuals are wearing N95 masks, gloves, and sometimes goggles. This was taken a couple weeks into the fire, but in the early days of the fire, N95 masks and other type of occupational health and protective equipment was not provided to farm workers that were laboring outside in the field. Even though they were exposing themselves to this hazardous air quality. And there was one instance in particular that the air was so hazardous that the regional office of the state occupational health and safety, Cal OSHA, actually closed its regional office because it was too hazardous for their state workers to go out and inspect the fields. but farm workers, the regulated community that they're supposed to protect, were actually still working in these hazardous conditions. And Cal OSHA did not open its office until, again, pressure from community-based groups to politicians in Sacramento for them to reopen the office. So there was a lot of inaccuracies or inequities, that is, of making sure that these individuals had the proper equipment to labor out in these fields. And again, N95 masks about 3-4 years ago, nobody really knew what they were. It was really hard to get them. But community groups had to take out of their own budget to buy these N95 masks in many cases, and particularly in the early days of the fire, and distributed them to individuals on the fields. Oftentimes, these community-based organizations that were trying to distribute them were chased off the fields and accused of trespassing. There was also instances where they saw that they were giving the N95 mask only to the male farm workers and not to the female farm workers. These are some important quotes that we had from our research. One Indigenous farm worker told us, "During the fire, I worked 3 days without a mask. It caused me headaches and watery eyes as well as a cough. We were scared because we were very near where the fires was occurring. The masks were not handed out until the city came to regulate." Another farm worker told us, "We all got sick, our throats closed in from breathing too much smoke, and our kids couldn't go to school. We had to buy masks and medicine for our throats and some goggles because my eyes were irritated when I worked." Other farm workers that we spoke to that were working hours, days, sometimes even weeks in these very hazardous conditions told us that they literally came home and had black saliva. The lack of occupational health and safety standards is of key concern as intensified wildfires and harvest season collide with harvest season each year. Undocumented farm workers are shouldering the burden of protecting the county's wine grapes from smoke and ash. Fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, from wildfire smoke, which again is a toxic mix of heavy metals and other chemicals from burning structures and objects, can be several times more harmful to human respiratory health than PM 2.5 from other sources such as car exhaust. Since 2015, in California, the annual mean of PM 2.5 has increased as a result of extreme wildfire events, and these events have overtaken as the main source of PM 2.5 exceedances. The harm that wildfire smoke has caused to farm workers may be greater than previously thought, bolstering the argument for additional research and policies to safeguard the most vulnerable and stigmatized populations. There was also economic and health impacts to workers. As you can imagine, those individuals that were laboring in the fields without proper protection were developing health conditions. And as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, many of these individuals that are undocumented are not part of the social safety net, meaning that they don't have health care. So if they labor, they enter into these hazardous conditions, sometimes mandatory evacuation zones to harvest the crops. There's no post-care for these individuals. There's no hazard pay for them to use to pay for some of their medical bills. Also, if they should get sick or they should lose their jobs because the fire destroys their work site, they're ineligible for unemployment assistance. As one Mixteca farm worker told us, the day the fire started, the sky was covered with smoke, and we were sent home. The next day, we didn't work because it was dangerous due to the fire. We lost power because it was cut off by the fire, and we lost food and milks for the kids. During the mudslides following fires, heavy rains caused mud flow from the fire debris. We couldn't get to work, and we were told to stay home for 2 days. There was also impacts to other workers besides farm workers, such as domestic workers and service workers. One domestic worker reported a case where she was asked to safeguard a home in a fire evacuation zone as her employer fled to safety. The domestic worker found herself trapped by roadblocks and mudslides for about a week. During this time, she was exposed to unsafe air and the threat of the fire overtaking the home. When the evacuation orders were lifted and the roads reopened, the domestic worker was asked by her employer to grab a few items from the house before she left. So this really shows the sort of the lack of humanity of this population and the safeguarding of this population to wildfires. Also, for other type of service workers as landscapers, they're also not provided with proper occupational health and safety standards. As you can imagine, after a fire, there's a lot of fire debris that has to be cleaned up, hauled away, scooped up, and somebody has to do that. So oftentimes, landscapers and other types of day laborers are asked to do this. They're not provided with the occupational health and safety training of the risk of handling this type of debris. They're not provided with the proper equipment as well. So the risks are really unknown to them, and how this is going to affect them in the long term. One landscaper told us, I could not get to the homes where I worked because the streets were closed. 2 of the homes I worked at were destroyed. One of my friends was lost during the mudslides. He had been only living in Montecito for 3 weeks before he died. I myself am a cancer survivor. I'm the only one who provides for the family. So this idea of this individual, this landscaper, this migrant worker having multiple forms of illnesses, comorbidities, it's important to understand that when a disaster strikes, such as a wildfire, these comorbidities are exacerbated and exacerbate their existing health disparities. So a disaster, a pandemic, a wildfire collide and work synergetically to amplify some of these health disparities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. Also, there was a lot of impacts because of immigration status, as I mentioned before, and disaster aid. Again, these individuals are ineligible to get federal disaster relief funds because of their immigration status. There's been studies that shows that the average recipient of a Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA funds, gets anywhere between $15,000 and $40,000 after a major disaster hits a city or a region. So these individuals get zero because they're ineligible for their federal, because of their immigration status. So in absence of federal assistance, community-based organization, migrant rights groups, and environmental justice groups developed a private disaster relief fund called the 805 Undocu Fund, 805 for the area code, telephone area code representing that area. The first Undocu Fund in the country occurred about 2 or 3 months earlier in Sonoma County, which was the Undocu Fund, which was the very first private disaster relief fund in the entire country dedicated to providing disaster relief services and funding to undocumented migrants during disasters. So the 805 Undocu Fund in the first year following the fire raised over $2 billion to provide to families and other undocumented workers to pay for health expenses, costs from unemployment, food that spoiled because of power outages, other daycare assistance issues that the individuals might have looking for other housing and work, also to pay for people that lost their homes during the wildfire. So since this first initial fire and now through the COVID-19 pandemic, they have raised, I believe, over $10 million, both from private individual funds as well as state and philanthropic sources. But this fund is always constantly being drawn on, and it gets depleted very easily. One domestic worker told us her experience with the 805 Undocu Fund. My husband was deported just before the fire. I was really struggling to find work in the fields. I finally got hired the first week in December 2017, was let go once the fire and smoke grew too big and the fruit spoiled. As the only breadwinner, I had to borrow money from friends and family to feed my kids. Our food went bad due to the power outage, adding to our expenses. I am grateful for the Undocu Fund assistance, and I am still in need of help and continue to coming to MyCup, the Mixteco Community Organizing Project, for other services. This fund is also important because of issues of immigration, deportation, and fear of deportation, particularly under the Trump administration when a disaster hit and individuals that were applying for disaster funds, there was fear that the information would be shared with ICE, the Immigration and Customs Services. So under federal laws and policies, if you have one individual in the household that is a legal resident and U.S. citizen, they're able to apply for disaster fund for the entire household, even if it includes undocumented immigrants. But households that were eligible for this were afraid to apply because there was a stipulation in the application that said that this information may be shared with Homeland Security, which also houses, again, Immigration and Customs Services. There was also loss of regional housing stock. As you can imagine, throughout California, particularly in our coastal regions, when we have a housing affordability crisis, so when any housing is taken away from the housing stock, it has a ripple effect throughout the region, and it drives up costs. So there have been cases, particularly in Ventura and parts of East Santa Barbara County, where landlords were price gouging during the first week or so of the fire, raising rents by anywhere between $200, $300, $400. So community groups had to really organize and protest these price hikes to ensure that individuals weren't being forced out of their homes. There was also loss of transportation and infrastructure. This is a picture of the 101 freeway connecting Santa Barbara and Ventura County. So this was after the heavy rains that created mudslides and brought all the fire debris onto the 101 freeway, the main arterial, again, connecting the two areas. So as you can imagine, this really limited the opportunities for migrant workers to go to their job sites and earn a living. Individuals either had to drive all the way around the mountainside, which was really costly, get on water taxis or rent a boat to go around, or take a train, which was also costly. So this further exacerbated the impacts after the fire when these mudslides occurred. So in sum, the major implication I want to leave you all with is for wildfire research, we need to think beyond just property values. Current disaster policies render many minority and poor communities of color invisible. As the case of Ventura and Santa Barbara counties show, migrant communities are among the most impacted during wildfires. Unlike race and ethnicity, immigration status has received little attention in disaster vulnerability research. Current disaster policies also fail to account for the complex web of effects that wildfires can have, far beyond the destruction of property within the perimeter of the fire itself. For example, toxic smoke flows down from burning mountainsides, settling in densely populated valleys below, threatening outdoor workers. Lavish hillside mansions are destroyed or evacuated, leaving low-wage migrant gardeners, housekeepers, and caregivers unemployed. Tourism throughout the region shuts down, putting thousands of hotel workers out of work. From the loss of housing and infrastructure to the closure of schools and job sites, the affected area is much larger than the footprint of the actual fire. For instance, a low-income migrant family living outside a burned area might lose several weeks of wages and might be ineligible for federal assistance. They stand to lose far more than a higher income homeowner within the fire risk zone whose property is replaced by their homeowner insurance policy, which also pays for hotel accommodations in the interim. So again, the main implication is thinking beyond property values. As we can see from this picture here, I think we all have become desensitized to an image of a young child wearing an N95 mask. But this picture was taken in 2017. So this really highlights how this population, from workers to their children, have been living with these disparate impacts from wildfires to the COVID pandemic, all occurring simultaneously sometimes for many years. So again, a policy implication is that if we really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants into our social safety net and ensuring that we provide disaster resources and knowledge and preparedness to this community, and we safeguard them and ensure that they are not hyper-marginalized when a disaster occurs. Moreover, we need to ensure that there's inclusive disaster planning that legitimizes migrant indigenous community knowledge and lived experience. We also need to embrace migrant communities in disaster planning, response, and recovery, and also bolster Latinx and indigenous civil society organizations' capacity in disaster relief and planning efforts. This really means really including this community before a disaster, understanding who they are, where they live, and understanding their cultural dynamics, and including that in our disaster planning process. And also funding these NGOs, these community-based organizations that are filling the gap of government and that are digging into their own limited budgets to provide these disaster relief services. In essence, they're becoming a disaster relief organization, but are not being compensated by government for handling these services. And then finally, we need more diverse disaster leadership. As this article in the Scientific American highlights at a congressional oversight hearing on disaster response, that our disaster infrastructure, in particular our disaster management, is often too white and male, and it does not represent the communities that are being first and hardest hit by climate change, and most importantly, some of these types of disaster. And then finally, here are some key highlights from my new research site in Sonoma County in Northern California. Many of you may know it as one of the country's premier or elite winemaking regions. This area has been hit by multiple extreme wildfire events, even more so than Santa Barbara and Ventura County. And in the recent fires that happened in September 2020 and August 2020, we still see vague statewide guidance for the implementation of worker health and safety. Cal OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Agency, has limited staff and only 26 Spanish-speaking field investigators in the entire state of California. And as far as the data shows, there's not one that speaks any indigenous Mexican languages. There's still uneven N95 mask implementation throughout the state, even in our climate of COVID-19 preparedness. Access verification permits continue to be allowed. These explicitly allow farm workers to enter into mandatory evacuation zones. These are permits that farm owners or supervisors petition and apply to the county agricultural commissioner for, and typically he grants them to allow these workers to enter into these mandatory evacuation zones to harvest the grapes to protect them from smoke and ash or that smoke taint. But what we're seeing from these permits, that employers have no emergency disaster plans. So if workers do enter into these areas, there's really no backup plans of how to safely get everyone out in terms of transportation, if the fire or toxic air should overtake that work site. There's no post-exposure health test for these workers. There's improper monitoring of air quality index. So they're supposed to be monitoring air quality index of how hazardous air quality is, but often they're using monitors that are stationary and often miles away from the actual job site. So there's no idea of how bad the air is on site where the workers are actually working. And there's also inadequate field sanitation. So we all know in COVID-19 and the pandemic, we need to have water stations and bathrooms so people can keep clean. But just imagine that happening with smoke and ash. And we're getting lots of accounts that there's improper field sanitation for people to wash their hands, let alone go to the bathroom during a wildfire. And there has been some progress in terms of language access and cultural competency, creation of Office of Equity in state and county agencies that I'll be happy to talk to you about. There are some moderate improvements that these community-based organizations have put forward, but I'll be happy to talk to you a little bit more about that during the Q&A. So again, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about how wildfires and the compounding of disasters are disproportionately affecting undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to having a creative and informative dialogue with you.